My name is Katy Hessel. I am an art historian and broadcaster, and I run a project called The Great Women Artists. And today I'm delighted to welcome photographers Olivia Arthur and Cristina de Middel, both Magnum photographers, and who have both also been nominated for the Prix Pictet, the leading award in photography and sustainability. And that's what today's talk is really going to be on. Olivia Arthur is a London-based photographer known for her in-depth work examining people and their personal and cultural identities. Cristina Middel is a Spanish photographer whose work investigates photography's ambiguous relationship to truth. She blends documentary and conceptual photographic practices and plays with reconstructions and archetypes that blur the boundaries between reality and fiction. And so what we're going to do, we're going to have a real sort of in-depth insight into these fantastic photographers' lives and works. We're going to look at their inspirations, we're going to look at their journeys, but I'd love to start with photography as the medium itself. And what do you think is the potentials or the power of the still image?
I think for me, it's what is left unsaid. Because when you take, maybe street photography is the perfect example for it, you take like a fraction of an action, but the way our brain works and the way how we become literate with images and how we need the sequence in our life, and we're time bound in general as animals, you imagine what happened before and you imagine what will happen after that frozen frame of action, no? And that for me, because it is very linked to reality, but also activates imagination a lot, is what makes it very attractive. For me, that's the power of photography, not what it shows. That can be more or less successful, more or less beautiful, more or less. I mean, there's plenty of ways, I guess, to decide if it's a good photograph or not. But it is what it doesn't show, what the frame doesn't show, what happened right before, how you can see what happened before and how you can see what will happen later, because we're not used of freezing time like it is, and that is, I think, super powerful. And that's why everybody, even if you're not educated or you're not that much into photography, we love seeing photographs because it activates things in our brain that are beautiful, I think.
What is it about the ambiguity of photography that you like?
Yeah, so when I've talked about the ambiguity, I mean, it's a lot of what Cristina has just said, this idea of not knowing what came before and what came after, but also not knowing what's just outside the frame. So it leaves you space, I think, to draw you in, and I think it lets the audience kind of be a part of. So if you watch something, a moving image on TV, it's quite passive. So I think when you look at a still photograph, it gives you an opportunity to engage with it and think about what else might be there. Why have you selected this part, this frame, this moment, but also this part, this kind of framing. Yeah. And I think of that ambiguity, and I think. When you refer to it in the books, I think of that, the ambiguity is also about the way you put pictures together. So I'm really interested in the kind of the series, over the single image, and how you can tell stories with it. There is the space between the pictures, so you jump from one thing to the next, and you build your narrative out of that. And I actually play with text in there as well, and sometimes for me text can be used almost like an image, like just a snippet of text. So it's not telling a whole story, but it just gives you a hint of something. And I sort of play with that like an image. So you've got all these little pieces, and you as a viewer have the opportunity to put those together in a way that makes sense for you. And I'd like to think that it's slightly different for everybody, and that's, I suppose, the ambiguity.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier about having, this idea of comic books and drawing. When was it that you actually wanted to pursue photography full time?
Well, for me, it was like a progression that was really marked by disappointments. So I had a disappointment and I found a solution to the disappointment. I started studying fine arts, wanting to be an artist. But then when I was studying art, I realized that the people that were in the 5th year of studies, I didn't understand what they were saying with their art. And most time the frustration, and I'm simplifying a lot here, but many times when you go to a gallery, you don't get a lot of what the artist means because the language is so complex and it's so codified. You need to have read the same books, you need to have the same references, cultural and intellectual references, to understand what he means by this piece of wood painted in white that means Europe in the future. I don't know, whatever the title can be, or Untitled 25/5. And it's like, okay. So from what is in the brain of the artist to what gets to the brain of the viewer, for me, it's too vague. For me, it's not a successful piece of communication. The language is so open that you miss the message. And I realized that when I was studying, and my reaction was just to go to the other extreme. And it was to just talk about things that are very easy to understand in a language that potentially everyone should understand. And photography is the perfect tool for that, because the interpretation the machine does of reality is almost... It's very, very subtle. It doesn't potentially, and also on top of that, you have this belief that photography equals truth. So it's very easy to just like, this is like that. And potentially for me, it was allowing me to make myself understood in a more efficient way. So I just went to the other extreme, that was photojournalism and telling stories to everyone that everybody could understand. And then from photojournalism, after 10 years in photojournalism, I felt limited by this simplicity of the language and how little room there was for opinion and interpretation. And then I took a few steps back to the art language, a more creative language, and I stayed in the middle, honoring my name.
I'm fascinated by this idea of sort of documentary photography versus photojournalism as well. And this idea that you can be an artist, I don't know, just the way that I guess photojournalism very much plays with news, plays with press. I mean, you both have veered off from this. What do you think attracted you to not wanting to have your work associated with sort of specific stories?
I don't think there's I actually think those things blend into each other. It's very, the terms are very restricting in a way, and documentary photography, photojournalism, I don't know. There's a lot of crossover between the two. What do they actually mean? Is it photojournalism only if it appears in a journal, a newspaper, or a magazine? And both of us make work that appears in newspapers and magazines, as well as work that goes into exhibitions and exists in other places. So I think. I'm probably not alone to say that it's difficult to get pinned down in those things, and I think, photography is the medium that we use to tell these stories, and they can be really simple things. They can also just be a portrait, and that can be a story in itself. But they can be complex, very layered stories. But
yes, and also I think it's two terms and two distinctions of this is photojournalism, this is documentary photography, that belong to the past.
Yeah.
It's 20 years ago, that was totally the case. And then you had art photography, the artist. I remember when I was in the newspaper, they used to call me the artist, making fun of me because I would take weird angles of things. But I think now photography has expanded so much. The world has become so much more complicated that just one approach is not enough. You need to make something that is layered, and in my opinion also. And also we, not only the relation with the photography, but the relations we as a society have with the idea of truth has changed a lot. Before the media were synonymous of truth, now not necessarily. So we have become more and more aware that we need to contrast the news and find more opinions around what we understand it's what really happened in a case. So photography has changed because society has changed, and these things, as you said, are maybe not as useful as they used to be 20 years ago.
Yeah, so these photographs, we'll get to in a second, are absolutely extraordinary. Tell us about the Afronauts and how this project came about.
So it was a reaction to the limitations I was feeling in working in a newspaper and telling the truth every day to everyone, the truth. And I found this story precisely because I started doing a type of research to challenge a little bit the language and what happens when you document something that is unbelievable. So if something that is hard to believe, but you take a picture of it, what would be the reaction? What is stronger? Logic or photography, the logic of society. So I was doing research on weird experiments in the 50s, when the US Army was training pigeons to play ping pong, this type of weird experiments that Americans do, sorry for the Americans. But it's very interesting because it's science, but crazy science, and it's really happened. So I wanted to do this series about crazy experiments. And I came up, I found this story online just by chance. And yes, for me it was not only, first I didn't believe it was true. And
Do you
I
mind
think
telling the story?
Yes. So the Afronauts is based on a real fact, like a real anecdote in history. In 1964, Zambia became independent from the UK, and they wanted to show the rest of the world that they were as powerful and respectable as a country, as a new country, as any other big country at the time. And the time was the Cold War and the space race. So the Soviet Union and the United States were fighting to put the first man in orbit. And just like if they became independent now, they would maybe go for genetics or for AI. At the time, in order, like the business card for the country was, let's have a space program. So they started the space program. It was led by a photography teacher, like science teacher in Lusaka. And he was training 20 men, 1 woman and 2 cats to go to the moon and then to Mars with a catapult system he had invented, of course. But the fact that it is funny, of course it's funny, but it's also sadly funny, because if it was a Norwegian space program, it wouldn't be funny, and they have maybe the same possibilities of going to the moon. So for me, that what was interesting is how my first reaction was that this is impossible. And this first reaction actually comes, at least as I understood, and things have changed a lot, by the fact that there was a big visual lack of representation, of real representation of Africa. And Africa as a continent was limited to a few stereotypes. So the fact that, okay, going to the moon, of course not, because it's just Maasai jumping in the jungle. So how are they going in the desert? It's not the jungle, the Maasai, okay. So, but the fact that I didn't believe it is like, I want to reproduce my reaction with the images. So I created images that do not document what happened, but they document the stereotypes. What we think Africa, if you close your eyes and I tell you this is an African space program, how do you imagine it? And this is prejudice, this comes from stereotypes. So it's actually documenting the stereotype we have of Africa based on 2 places that I didn't know, space and Africa, documenting them just by what had left of like all this sort of visual propaganda we have from the continent. Because I have never been to space, but I know what it looks like, and the same goes for Africa. And so I did a story about that and a book, and Martin Parr helped me a lot, and I am here now. Yeah. Basically, it's responsible for most of the things that happened to me afterwards. So
yeah, I mean, it's such an extraordinary, just full of beauty as well. I mean, it's just captured the materiality of it is so stunning. But Olivia, one of your and during the same year in 2012, you made Jeddah Diary, which was about well, some 2012.
We were inspired. That year we were inspired.
And this looked at the lives of women in Saudi Arabia. I mean, again, maybe a new place to you. I'm fascinated how that came about, and this idea of going to places that are actually unknowns, or perhaps you knew it already.
No, absolutely. I mean, that definitely was a big unknown for me. I mean, that project came, at the end of a long body of work that I had been making about women and young women and looking at, cultural divides and cultural influences, and it actually started out with this project that I called the Middle Distance, which was about the border between Europe and Asia, which in turn came from the fact that I lived in India for a couple of years right at the beginning of my career. So I was sort of looking for a place where things crossed over. And then, of course, you go to the border of Europe and Asia, and what you get is nothing that's like here or India, but it's its own place in itself. But it was a starting point for me, and I did this big journey and kind of traveled and met a lot of people, and then I took that work further. I ended up going to Iran, and then this opportunity came to go to Saudi Arabia. In fact, the British Council asked me to go and teach a workshop, and it was kind of like, go teach a workshop, let's see if you can make any images. I couldn't, at that time, understand whether I would be able to really work there, and I remember I spoke to a couple of photographers I knew who'd been there and said, like, what's it like? What can I expect? What can I do? And one of them told me, what you should do is get a spy camera and wear a burqa, I think it was what he said, which is not actually a Saudi thing. And the other one told me the story of how he had a government minder that was with him all the time and he couldn't do anything. So I kind of went without much expectation, but also just not knowing what I would find. And And I think it was, I mean, I feel like we've seen, even in the period since then, we already like have seen more from there. But I went and I taught the workshop first, and it's a kind of, was a really, I mean, it was a helpful introduction. So I had 12 young women who were my students, and I tried to help them make photography, which, you know, it's a country that has a very complicated relationship to photography because of the relationship to privacy that exists there, and what you can show and what you can't show is very unclear, and you have these, you know, obviously you know, you have protected spaces that you can be in one sense, but you can't, you know, you take a photograph, you want to be able to share it, and I always went there, and I was always quite open about the fact that I'm a professional photographer, and if I take an image, I want to be open with you. If I take an image, that means I want to be able to share it, and it was really tricky, and I had to find my way around how to do that, and I had to question why I was trying to do it and what's the point. Like, if this place wants to be so private, why should I be here trying to photograph it and take these pictures away? And yeah, it was a complicated process, and I you know, and then I met women there who said, no, but do it, like, go and show people that our world is not as bad as they think it is. And so then I had all these pictures that, a little bit from the streets, but then from the people that I've met, a whole bunch of pictures with images that I couldn't, like, where I couldn't show faces, a whole bunch of images of women who, you know, put on their cover so that we could take pictures because that was the way that they would be comfortable for me to show these images publicly, and it didn't quite make sense in a way, and so you can't just put all these images together and say, well, this is what it's like, and you know, I have an image where they're sitting in bed wearing their full covers, and I have someone who said to me, but they don't wear that in bed, and it's like, I realize, you know, how much it's not, you know, even if you think, you know, it's something that you must come across a lot, which is like, you think you're doing something that is very clearly ironic, and people don't realize it. And so, yeah, it's actually quite difficult for me to put that work together. And then when I did, I made this book, Jeddah Diary, and the only way I could do it really was to try and talk about my experience and just put it in like, okay, sort of these almost like anecdotes. So it was all these anecdotes of different things that I was able to see, or I was able to partially see, or I was able to partially show. And then I had these texts in between that were like the missing pictures, because there were some times when it was like, you don't bring your camera here. Like, I saw some amazing things that I couldn't photograph at all, and they'll just have to remain that way.
It's all about the outside space. we can all imagine it. But I'm fascinated. I mean, you both work with real people and real people's stories, and I'm fascinated about your process with that. And so when you are dealing with people, and often maybe marginalised people, how do you work with them in telling their stories? Or is it more about you telling your story? Do you converse with them? What's the sort of process for that kind of thing?
Well, in my case, I think it's changed. There's been an evolution, of course, since I started, and I self-assigned myself the mission of saving the world with photography, or making a better place with photography. Now, like, my expectations are way more controlled. I don't know. For me, it is half. Half of the picture is mine, half of the picture is of the person I am photographing, and I really want it to be understood like that. I have a very tense or conflictual relation with truth as an idea myself, and I find it very funny to play with it. So with my work, I try to be very honest with the subject. I think that is very important. Explain everything that I'm going to do with the picture, what I think it's going to become, what I want it to mean. And I also keep myself very open to the influence of the other person. I show it, do you like it now in digital? Do you think, what do you think? So it's not just, hey, bye.
This is a very collaborative process, really.
I think it has to be, but this is something that we are starting to do now. It was not like that 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Not at all like that. You would not show your work to the person. It was a question of trust, because photography was trustful. But now things have changed.
There's also a question of like the way that you do it, and for me, like, I started. I mean, when you hit against some of these questions for yourself of how you take pictures, you run away. What are you doing with it? I also changed the camera that I was using, and I started using this large format camera, which is, it's really big and cumbersome, and you put it on a tripod, and you like talk about what you're going to do, and you measure the light, and there's no surprise, like you're not grabbing a picture. So the process of making a portrait in that way is collaborative in the sense that it's very open. It feels very honest to me. I think, and I really responded to that process. So I carried on photographing, in that way for a long time. And it's not always easy to use a camera like that. And you don't, you restrict your opportunities. But I think that there's something in that, the honesty that you get when you work that way. And you ought to be able to do it with any camera. But sometimes it helps you, the way, just the way that it slows you down. It makes you sit and talk with someone, and I often sit and talk with them about what kind of picture we might. This is in the case of a portrait, I guess, and of course, there's a lot beyond that. But sitting down and just talking about the kind of pictures that you're expecting to make, and also, for me, showing people the kinds of pictures that I've been making. It's normally part of a series, so there's like, okay, this is what I've been doing. These are the kinds of pictures I'm making. Does that make, and that tends to be something that opens people up, because they see themselves then as part of something bigger rather than it's just you coming to take their photograph.
Yeah, and more recently, I mean, you've very much been looking at bodies and technology, and what has kind of brought that on? So I started making this work about bodies. I mean, that really came from when I had kids, so being pregnant and like thinking about my body for the first time, I suppose, ever in a proper way, as a sort of machine, I suppose, doing a job. And so it made me reflect in a different way, and I started photographing bodies, intimacy, and I made a lot of work in that way. But then it was also, then I took it to this extra level with this project about technology and how we could use technology to enhance and repair our bodies. And then that kind of even went a little bit further, and you talked about real people, but actually there are in there some pictures of non-real people. So there are some robots, and there's a baby there that is, a robotic baby that you can look after, and it'll do all sorts of things, but it's not real. Yeah, that was sort of taking it to its furthest extreme. Yeah, and obviously we are in the Prix Pictet lounge, and this talk is also about sustainability. I mean, I'm fascinated. Sustainability has become this sort of such hot topic, especially over the sort of last 5 years. Everyone is so conscious of it now. Do you think it's something that you think about when you photograph, when you create a series? Are you thinking about the ecology of the world?
Well, I don't think it depends very much on the projects that I am doing. But I think in general, even now, that there's plenty of questions that we ask now as creator of images and as creator of opinion, in a way, a visual opinion, that were not on the table, again, 5 years ago, because things have really changed a lot. And in the same way that you question why you self-assign yourself to talk about this topic, who are you to talk about this? Or who are you to travel there? The legitimacy when it comes to putting a message out there. You also think of what is at the first stage, like with even the ecological impact of you traveling there.
Yeah.
And yes, but also at the same time, I mean, you can go in a very small scale and big scale. You can. I don't know. It's become so much a topic that sometimes it loses, in my opinion, the strength, because it's become like a trend.
Yeah.
But there's also something about where it crosses. I mean, the work that I put in this slideshow of the Altar Mountain, that we were sort of roughly together when I was making that work, and which is about a place that is on the US-Mexico border, which is a crossing point for migrants, and so it has that sort of political background, but it's also a nature reserve. So it's kind of, I looked at it with those two things. So it's not necessarily something on its own, and these things cross over. So a place that has a political story has, underneath that another story which might be more about sustainability. And I'm sure, for example, people who might be making work in Ukraine right now. So you can be making work in Ukraine and thinking about the war and what's going on. But then underneath there's the story of grain and what's happening there in the world food markets, and it kind of crosses into stories rather than having to always be the story itself.
Yeah. So maybe not everything is about ecology, but it's more like a layer. For me, at least, it's before you used to take the photos and not think of so many aspects about it, as I said, legitimacy and so on. And now it's like the ecology layer. You need to include it in the picture. It's not something you can. I think it just talks and dialogues around like the old arrogance of men towards nature, and how now you just cannot do like that. Just like you have to respect gender identity, just like you have to consider so many things before you talk. Being aware that you're not like the master of the planet is just like a filter you cannot just remove at this point, because it's part of it.
Yeah, the sensitivity.
Sensitivity to it, yeah. So it's like a layer you put to everything you do. So the work doesn't necessarily have to be about ecology or environment, but it's going to be there just like so many other aspects are now there when you shoot and when you put work out there.
And right now you're in between series. You're working on a gentleman's series.
Yes.
I mean, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I mean, it's a series precisely about that. I mean, prostitution has been like romantically presented as the oldest profession in the world, but always from an angle that links it to criminality, to exploitation. And for me, yes, of course, there is that angle. But in terms of how visually it's been represented, if you do a Google search and type prostitution or sexual work, the first 1,000 pages will be women in the street or in rooms, but you never see the client. And for me, this is like a failure of photography, because we haven't explained half of the business. And what I try to do also, because it is an information that is normally void for women, because if you're a man, you can really go and ask your friends and what it is about. I really want to understand how it works. You ask your friends, I don't know, you ask your father, your brother, I don't know, or even go and ask the sexual worker. But as a woman, you cannot ask your brother, you cannot ask your father, you cannot ask your friends, you cannot ask the girl who is working. So as women, we are bound to never have that information. And what I did in this project, and I started in 2015, was to go and interview the men and take a picture of them so we can see what they look like. And normalize or not, but I mean, then you judge, then you decide if it's good or if it's bad, if it's exploitation, if it's crime. But we're missing half of the information, half of the picture, and we cannot really have a good opinion about it, a formed opinion about it. So I started in Rio, I have done it in 8 cities now: Havana, Lagos, Bangkok, Mexico City, Kabul. I always forget the list, but it's 8 cities. Amsterdam, I was shooting until yesterday, and Mumbai next week. And I want to have, I don't know, because we need a mission in life, 100 interviews and 100 portraits, and I will finish it in July. It's called Gentleman's Club, and I can't wait to have it done. It's very interesting. Very interesting. Also because the information, not the work. I mean, the information that is there is really interesting. I learned a lot, and my opinion about sexual work became really now I feel complete. So I think that's one of the roles of photography, to understand the world you live in. For me, it's one of the main roles in any way you want to do it. Like, there's, again, no police of photography who will take you to the prison of photography, because you can do whatever you want as long as you explain with images the world. So yeah, that's Gentleman's Club.
Absolutely. We'll open up to questions in a second. But Olivia, I'd also like to ask, what are you working on at the moment, or what's next that you want to make?
Well, so I'm sort of continuing this work which explored this relationship to, of our bodies and technology, and yeah, so this is a guy with a camera in his eye, and I don't know if there's another picture, but he it's not there, but he could photograph me as I was taking a picture of him. So it was, yeah, I'm kind of looking to explore and sort of bring this work all together, the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the pictures of how we feel, about our own bodies, to the quiet portraits, but with this going a little bit further into these sort of motion series and how, just trying to understand the human body and kind of how far it can go and how far we might go into trying to replicate it. I mean, it's kind of interesting because when it came to it and when I pushed as far as I could go with that work and went out to try and meet like the robot makers who we see in sci-fi films, the robots that walk around and do all this sort of thing. And we have this idea, I mean, although we know that those are not real, we have this idea that technology can do quite a lot of that. And actually what I found in the process is that there's an awful lot it can't do. And that was quite interesting. Like just to have a robot that can balance and walk on 2 feet is extremely difficult. And it's not as much out there as we think about it. So it sort of almost kind of comes back around to the body and how much we can do. So I'm sort of continuing that work and putting it together.